Welcome to PHP Podcast. I'm Mike.
And this is Orlando. And we're on episode 167.
Yeah.
And we haven't changed our shirt in 6 days or whatever since the last podcast.
Yeah. Or we just recorded 2 back to back. And that's what happened. Because
I totally forgot to change my shirt. Well, the reason being is because you're still on hiatus.
Yeah, I'm out and about. So again, check YouTube and there should be some videos posted of our trip. If not, then I have failed completely, and there's obviously a very good reason for it. But otherwise, there should be some great videos on there of my road thrift trip. And but today is a really special...
Wait. Before we start, I have an idea. Wouldn't it be cool? You know how those radio shows, how they always have the random guest fill-in?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder who that would be. If we're gone and then somebody else takes over PHP Podcast for an episode.
Yeah.
That would be interesting. Like listening to our show...
But somebody else doing it.
But somebody else is doing it.
But like our format or something.
Like doing the Bellow and Hustle of the Week, and I don't know, it'd be interesting.
Yeah. Let us know in the comments below
who should fill in.
Who should be the guest hosts.
That would be cool. I don't know how we would swing that, but that'd be kind of then you know we're next level.
We should do crossover, like me and you should host somebody else's show and then they can host ours. Like if you watch Parks and Rec, there's this ongoing bit. They only do it a few times, but there's this jazz show that Leslie goes on sometimes to talk, and it's like a radio jazz show.
Yeah.
And the guy talks like this, and he's really monotone. And today on our and the funny thing is, he sometimes says, "I'm so and so, and I'm filling in for John blah blah blah," and John is currently in Minneapolis covering for so-and-so who's covering for, like, it's just like they're covering for each other. And so anyways, that'd be fun to have.
I just had that random thought because I'm like, yeah, we're wearing the same shirts, and I'm like, oh no. And Mike's like, well, it is what it is. We're recording back to back. So,
yeah. And honestly, like I live in a trailer and I've kind of gone minimalist. So I only have so many shirts that I wear.
It's true. I have 5 of the same black shirts that I wear. I rotate different color shirts so people don't accuse me of.
Yeah, 167 episodes. You know, we can't be like, what was her name from Wheel of Fortune, where it's a different
Vanna
outfit
White.
Every single episode. But
I don't think I could be like Vanna White. Yeah, something.
There's a few differences there. But anyways, this is a special episode because we are doing our level up review of the book that Orlando has been dying to do. And honestly, I mean, I think you've been pretty excited about it. I know I've been excited about it because this is probably one of the very first books that I read that had a huge impact on my life. And I kind of went through part of the program and listened to Audible, and I listened to his radio program for a long time, a lot of Dave Ramsey stuff. And it really changed my philosophy on debt and on how to save money and how to be financially literate, like we talked about in our last Level Up book. So we are finally doing a Dave Ramsey book, and it's exciting because I've known so many people who've had huge success from this program. I know like some churches will like offer it for people to come and they can, get the whole kit, and they actually learn and they literally, their lives are changed because they get control of their finances. And one of the number one things that people stress about in life is finances. A lot of marriages suffer because of it. A lot of families, there's just a lot of pain over finances. And if you can implement, and I would say of all of the books that we read, a lot of them have like gimmicky kind of I don't want to say they're all get rich quick, but there's like, do this thing and you're going to be this. And Dave Ramsey is just this is a simple thing and things you can do. And it's hard and it takes a lot of time, but it's guaranteed if you do these things, unless there's some unforeseen thing and like there's crazy medical something, I mean, anything can happen. But if you're able to implement these things, you can get out of debt and you can get control of your finances. And that is so important for so many people. So I'm excited to be doing Total Money Makeover.
Yeah. And I want to build on that a little bit because, I had mentioned when we read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the messenger that was telling me to read the book, I didn't necessarily believe what that person was telling me because of who they were. And so I passed on that book. But if I read that book 10 years ago, I could be in an entirely different place. And the same thing with Total Money Makeover. Now, before I move on, the interesting thing is that Mike and I don't have a hard copy of the book because we both had it online because we had to get this quick, right?
Yeah.
And on top of that, I had several copies, but I gave them all away. And that's one of the things that Dave Ramsey pushes, that like once you see the validity of the program, you're going to want to let other people know. And for me, I remember like one of the first things I did, I think I purchased like 5 to 10 books, and I always had them in my library when I was library that I go get. My library. I was a school administrator, by the way. Just like, maybe that's why I'm not. I don't know. Anyway, just joking. So I had these in my library in case I ever had teachers that were new or were struggling financially. And we ever got to a conversation about finances during, whenever they had a review or they just wanted to, shoot the breeze, I would always go like, hey, here's a book that changed my life. Right. And I would explain it. Now, when somebody first approached me with this book, I thought it was a scam, because you have this feeling you get hit with so many scammers, right? The get rich, even some of the videos that drop on our YouTube, right? On the ads, right? By the way, we had Rich Dad Poor Dad show up on ours.
Nice.
So, maybe he'll be on the podcast one day. That doesn't mean anything. But you look at it and you're like, no, this is real. Like, and this is exactly what I wanted to say is what my thought was. This is not this get rich. And our podcast has never been that. This is real. And the other thing I want to let you know is that, this does come from a different worldview that some of you may agree with, some of you may not. And so don't discount the book because you're like, hey, I'm not a Christian, or hey, I don't believe how Dave does about these things, because the principles are universal and they're still true. And I'm a living testament of it. Mike's a living testament of it. And there are thousands, probably millions of people that are debt-free because of this. Now, it's interesting.
And he's not super, just to say, to clarify on that, he's not super preachy throughout. So he'll reinforce a concept that, like you said, is universal truth, that's tried and true. And then he'll like reinforce it with like maybe a proverb or something like that. But yeah, anybody can read this and apply these principles and it'll change your life. Yeah.
And so I want to start before we start with chapter 1, when he talks about what the book is not, because I think he does a great job of discussing, because he says that a lot of people try to complicate things too much, right? And you see that all the time, right? You see these ads and it's like, right, that the whole goal is to get you to just know a little bit so they can charge you more, right, to get the next book or get the next course. This isn't that. This book is complete. Like, you literally could do this book and you're set. Now, he has a lot of other books that I believe are worth your time reading. But to me, this is the practical how-to.
Yeah, and just again, we kind of did it in reverse order. What I mean by that
I see what you're saying.
We did Rich Dad Poor Dad, which is building on wealth. Once you've already, I would say it's probably not as applicable to people who are literally drowning in debt and not able to make it month to month. This book will get you out of that. It can get you debt free. And then there are principles that it can use to help kind of get you going. But this isn't like an investing book or a book on how to become a real estate mogul or anything like that. This is how can any person go from being swamped and overrun by debt to being a person who is able to pay their bills, have money, and not be living with the bondage of debt and owing people money.
It's just a terrible place to be.
Yep.
I mean,
sleepless nights and stress.
And we'll talk about that as we get through the book, right? Because there's a freedom in this book, and that's what we want, is financial freedom for everyone, right? Because as resellers, and we'll get started, but I just want to share one more thing, is I really believe, now that it's my third year full-time, that I could not have been a full-time reseller had I not been able to handle my own personal finances. Right? Because as much as I joke around about like I hate spreadsheets and I hate bookkeeping and reality is I do those things. I don't do them great, but I do those things. But on top of that, in order for me to be full-time, I had to figure out like what my bills were, where my money was going, what I was doing with that money. And I had to be in a certain place where I was not in debt to be able to say, hey, I have capital, I have savings, I have a contingency plan in case things go poorly. And so all that I actually can tie back to the decade ago where I actually delved into this book and applied these principles. So hopefully this will do the same for a lot of you.
Yep. Very good. So one of the things and I'll just briefly kind of share, there's a lot of stories. And honestly, when I read stuff like this, a lot of times I skim through the personal testimonies because I just want to get to the meat of it. And I get that anecdotally, here's people who've applied this, but he kind of gives a little bit of background in his story. And he was on paper or society would have looked at very wealthy. He had like $4 million in real estate, but the reality was he wasn't managing his money properly. He ended up going bankrupt and it destroyed him. And a lot of people have been there. Maybe you weren't at a place where you had $4 million, net worth as it seemed like, and then lost it all. Maybe you never had it and you feel lost. And he says this, and maybe a lot of you can relate. He says, I didn't feel like some powerful adult. Instead, there was a little boy inside of me who was very afraid of this month's bills, afraid of the month's mortgage, and absolutely terrified when I considered the future. How was I to send my kids to college, retire, enjoy life, and not live at the edge of money worries? And I think that so many people are there and they feel that. Or maybe you're not like that bad, but you're just making it and it doesn't feel good, right? You don't feel good when you're just making it. And a lot of people are stuck in this average. I would say he at one point says it's something to the effect of 90% of the population is really financially unfit. And it becomes almost the norm. It almost becomes this is acceptable. This is just what people do. And the reality is it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to accept this is just the way it is. There's a way out of that.
Agreed. And what I like is he starts off right away in the first chapter, right? His first chapter, talking about the idea. Sorry, I need to step up closer to the mic. He talks about the idea that these principles, like you financially should be able to be doing well in the good and the bad. And that's a tough one. Right. But a lot of us experience that during this pandemic or this ongoing pandemic. Right. Because initially, right, when everything hit, like it was bad. Right. And so the question is, were we all ready to accept the bad? And what not meaning accept the death toll, not meaning accept that our lives would be forever changed because we would miss like being around people. But would we be willing to accept that, hey, I financially am able to last 6 months to a year or however how long this goes? Like, can I do that? Right. And I think it was a wake up call for many of us. It was a wake up call for me. Right. I remember even me who had, I was okay for a few months. I even started stressing going, have I not done enough to make sure I am secure financially? Right. And he talks about that because he gives a story about what happened in 2008. A lot of people made bad choices and they took out subprime loans and they couldn't pay the mortgage and they defaulted and, that whole recession took place. But then also talks about the idea that, hey, you should always be ready for the good and the bad, right? The key thing is that if you're always saying, hey, as long as things are good, I'll be fine. That's a terrible place to be.
Yeah. I mean, that's so true because and we haven't really gotten to that point even in our reading at this point of all the practical, true. But one of the things that is so important in his philosophy in one of his first steps is kind of having $1,000 in savings kind of for the rainy day. And this is important because a lot of people will say things like, I had to get new tires as an unexpected, expense, or I had to replace my 8-year-old refrigerator, unexpected expense. And he really says, look, these are not unexpected expenses. Things go bad. You're going to have to get tires and oil changes and something's going to break in your house and you're going to have to replace this. These things, you can't just live your life with the expectation that you're going to be able to go from now till you die with nothing going wrong. Those things happen.
Let me share a quote from the first chapter under flying turkeys. So when he's talking about flying turkeys, it's like, just because you saw a turkey flying in a tornado doesn't mean that anytime you see a turkey, they can fly, right? And so right now, before the pandemic hit, man, we had all kinds of entrepreneurs, right? We probably still do. I mean, entrepreneurship, it's kind of interesting because you heard a lot of people always say that like, hey, when the economy gets hit hard, then we're going to find out who the real entrepreneurs is. But you know what happened? We got a bunch of new entrepreneurs, right? I'm seeing stories about people like on Fiverr making thousands of dollars each month. I'm seeing entrepreneurs that have been making money in the stock market. I'm seeing entrepreneurs that have made money that adapts to the current time of like contactless, delivery of items, or, plexiglass companies that figured out that, hey, they could, instead of producing plexiglass for this, they can now produce it as barriers between people at stores. Like there's been a lot of entrepreneurs. But what Dave Ramsey is talking about is that, hey, when things are really good, it's kind of easy to make money. It's kind of easy for things to go well. So let me read this real quick. He says, what does this all mean for your total money makeover? The first lesson of this economic storm is that your financial process and principles must work in good times and in bad times. Otherwise, they don't work. You got to understand that. You kind of like, this should be a plan that you put together as you build your finances, that no matter if things get bad, you're still going to be okay. You're not depending on things to be good. Our economy had been so good for so long that really stupid ideas had been working on the short term. And we experienced that, I would say, the last few years, right? I mean, there was all kinds of stuff where people are just on social media, like they can just come up with an idea, and as long as there is a following in a market, they can make money. But now, as people are retracting their expenses, right, they may be less likely to spend money on items like that. So then he says, the economy was so good that fooled people into believing that stupid had become smart. In other words, stupid hadn't been stress tested in quite a while. When it finally was, it came up looking, well, stupid. Right? When times are booming, you can do dumb things with money, get sloppy and take huge risks without realizing it. I've heard it said this way: even a turkey can fly in a tornado. People were running around buying things they couldn't afford with money they didn't have to impress people that they didn't even like, and they were doing it in record numbers. Worse, they seemed to get away with it. And I feel like we experienced some of that for a little while. And now we're in a different time, and we're all, I say in generalities, but I would say a lot of us in the reselling community have experienced how to pivot, how to make things happen. And now I think a lot of us are looking to be financially sound no matter what happens. Right? Does that all make sense?
Yeah, it's good.
All right. So what else you got from the first chapter here?
You're not even in the first chapter yet.
Am I not even in the first chapter?
No,
Wow,
I've been reading quotes from the first chapter. You're still in the intro.
So good.
But
so good. Sorry.
It's good. So one of the
wonder
things
you gave me that look. I was wondering, Mike kept giving me this look. And I'm like, what?
I'm just thinking like we're like almost 20 minutes in and you're in the intro still. And I'm in the, we were in different places and I didn't actually read the intro. So I was like, what is he reading? And I'm like, oh, that's where he is.
Read the intro.
I normally
it's
read,
worth it.
I normally read intros, but I tried to power read through this one because I've already done it in the past. Now, one of the things I like, he says here, a myth, he does a lot of like myth versus truth. And these are just very practical things that people often have wrong about finances. And one of the things he says is people will say, I don't have time to work on a budget, retirement plan, or estate plan. And the truth is, he says, you don't have time not to. And that's so real. Like people think that budgeting just seems so hard. And honestly, we're kind of on autopilot now. My wife and I, we've been doing it for so long. We have like our systems in place and we revisit like once every 3 or 4 months. We'll say, okay, have things changed? Let's change how much we're doing here and there. But when we were first trying to get ahead and get out of debt and get things figured out, we would literally sit down at a kitchen table once a week before the week started. And it was like an hour. We went through every single expense we had. What's our budget? Are we going over in here? How much money do we have left in our food fund? How much money? And it took a lot of time, but I just remember that hour once a week has changed our life. And if we had we not done that then, we'd be at a way different place today. We would still be, I think, living paycheck to paycheck. And so the reality is, you can think you don't have time for that, but you don't have time not to do that. You need to do that because, and one thing that I kind of wrote down, I annotated later on in the book, but I think it applies here, is 10 years is going to pass no matter what. Time is going to pass no matter what. And I always think about this with habits, right? Whether it's fitness or I think fitness is always just a great correlation. It connects with so many aspects of life, but diet and exercise. A lot of people get discouraged when they think like, it's going to take me 6 to 8 months to see the results I want to see. And people want it today. They want it now. And so they get discouraged and they don't act. And the truth is that 6 to 8 months, or maybe in cases of finances, 5 years to get debt free, maybe it's 10 years. And you can think this is just too much. I don't have time to think about to plan the next 10 years and really spend time each week getting to that place. That 10 years is going to pass. And if you didn't do those things, you're going to be in a worse place. And so that time is going to pass. And so you need to spend the time now figuring this out. And maybe you're okay. Maybe you're not living paycheck to paycheck. But if you don't have a plan to get 6 months of savings, get a year worth of savings, pay off all of your debt. If you don't have those plans, those things aren't going to happen on their own. You have to be taking proactive steps. And so you don't have time because, and the reality too is eventually you're going to die. And even with that, with like the estate planning or retirement, if you're lucky enough to live that long and you get to that place, you're not always going to be able to work. And so to think, like going back to that idea of unexpected expenses, to think that you can just put it off, that day is coming. You cannot avoid the inevitable and just pretend it doesn't exist. That time is coming. And so you might as well be taking the steps now. And he also says, and I really love this, and this kind of goes back to one of my big kind of core philosophies. He says, winning at money is 80% behavior and 20% head knowledge. What to do isn't the problem, doing it is. And a lot of times people do kind of have a general idea of what's right, or I can in 10 minutes tell you the basics of his plan to the point where you could, if you implemented them, it would change your life. Right? Just very simple.
Seriously, it sounds so gimmicky when we say that, but it's real.
And the reason why is because it's only 20% of its head knowledge. And I can give that to you really quick. 80% of it, though, is are you actually going to do it? Do you have the discipline? Do you have the fortitude? Do you have the consistency to actually implement the things that you should be doing? And he has this phrase that he'll repeat multiple times throughout the book. And it's, so if you listen to his radio program, it's like the thing. And it's so true. If you live like no one else, later you can live like no one else. And the whole point of that is you are going to have to make sacrifices. One of the key components of total money makeover and being able to get out of debt is spending the hour a week or whatever it is, doing your budget, putting money in envelopes, making sure you don't overspend, making sure you're cutting expenses where you can. And your friends might be like, hey, let's go out to eat. I mean, I tell you from a person who's gone through this, when I have a friend, I'm like, hey, let's go out to dinner. And he's like, honestly, we don't have it in our food budget for the month. I don't get offended. If I didn't go through this, I might be like, what? Come on, man. We're just going to, to the brewery. True. Let's go hang out. But for me, when I hear somebody say that, I'm like, good for you. Like that is like, you keep at this. If you stick with this 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you're going to be the one saying, hey, let's go out to eat. I'm buying, right? Because you can live and you can buy all of the things you want to buy without worrying about money and worrying about debt if you're willing to make sacrifices now. But if you don't make those sacrifices now, you're going to live like everybody else, paycheck to paycheck, struggling to make ends meet. But if you're willing to make sacrifices now, then later you can live like nobody else is living.
And it's interesting that you say all that, right? Because one of the mantras in the reselling community, right, is breaking that 9 to 5, getting out of that 9 to 5. But the reality is, like, if you're in debt, you may go into reselling and you may break that 9 to 5, but you're still kind of in the same scenario, right? You're still working for someone else. That person may be MasterCard, Visa, Discover. Like, you're working for someone else still, right? You've just changed bosses. That's all you've done.
Yeah, and he uses the phrase multiple times throughout this book, and it's such a good concept. And I know it carries connotations that can cause people to be frustrated or maybe not see it for what it's really saying. But the idea of like master and slave, right? The person who is the lender is the master of the person who is working. The person who is working to pay off the lender is really, if you think about it, a slave to the lender, slave to the debt, because you are working so that you can pay that person. You're working so that you can make sure that they are making money and they're getting wealthy. And you're doing that so that you can, like you said earlier, maybe impress people that you don't even really like, right? I want to have the car. I want to have this outfit. I want to have this brand on my shirt. I promise you, if you're willing to go without any name brands on top of other things that he implements, but you go out, you wear clothing that is not name brand clothing for long enough and implement his stuff, pretty soon you can walk into any high-end store and buy whatever you want and not have to think about it because you got the cash for it. And people will be jealous about what you're wearing and you didn't have to go in debt to do it. But it was because for a long time, you weren't wearing Gucci. You weren't wearing Prada. You weren't wearing these high-end stuff because
you sold it.
Yeah, for resellers, we sold it.
There you go. So, but it's so key to understand because, man, it's interesting to me that in the reselling community, we don't have a lot of talk about this, right? We have a lot of talk about scaling business. We have a lot of talk about being an entrepreneur, what it means to be an entrepreneur, but being fiscally sound in your personal finances, to me, it's the beginning. It's the beginning. I would be
foundational.
I would be scared if I couldn't handle, let's say I was making $50,000 a year reselling. If I couldn't handle in my personal finances $50,000, how could I handle $500,000 or $1 million or $5 million? Like, that would be scary, right? If I don't know where every dollar is going, imagine how much money you'd be losing as you scale, right? That's why it's important to budget, and that's why it's important to have a deep understanding of where your money is going and telling your money where to go. But we'll talk about that a little bit
And
later.
that's why so many people have this false idea that if I just got a raise, I'm making 50,000, but if I was making 70,000, I'd be set. I would be able to pay all my bills. And then they get to 70,000 and they're in the exact same place. If I could just make 90,000. And if you don't actually learn the foundational skills of how to manage the money, you can get $1 million. And if you're not using it correctly, you're going to be in the same place. You are going to be hemorrhaging money all the time, and you are going to be losing wealth. And so the truth is, you can be making $40,000, $30,000 a year and actually be building wealth and be better off than a person making $100,000 a year. As crazy as that sounds, because our culture, and it goes back even to Rich Dad Poor Dad, our culture tells us work to make more money. Whereas the reality is, if you can manage the money you have, leverage the money you have now properly, you can be far better off than the person who makes 10 times as much as you're making, but is drowning in debt, and it could all come collapsing down like a house of cards.
Agreed. Now let's get to the tougher part. So he has this whole thing about his promise to you, but basically, let me just read the line. He says, your situation isn't your spouse's fault. Well, maybe, but we'll talk about that later. He says, at least, I don't know. It isn't your parents' fault. It isn't your children's fault. It isn't your friend's fault. It is your fault. And that's a tough one. Right? And, I remember when I think when I started this, I was mid-30s. I can't remember. I'm now almost 41. But it was tough to recognize that, and I already knew, but when you really have to recognize that you messed up. This is a result of my mismanagement of money. That had I from the very beginning implemented principles of, not spending more than I have. Very basic. I mean, we all know that as a little kid, you shouldn't spend. But then when you get older, right, you get these credit cards, and we'll talk about that a little bit. You get credit cards, and you can get a loan, and you want to keep up with the Joneses. And before you know it, you begin to say, well, if only I had this high paying job, if only I had the opportunities. I mean, I grew up, in a different scenario than a lot of people that I know right now. And it's interesting because I know a lot of people that are always like, hey, I'm in this situation because of this happened to me 20 years ago, or this is the result of this, government action, or this is the result. No, ultimately, if we're in a bad financial place, it's our fault.
Yeah.
And that's a hard one to think about.
Yeah. And if you're really deep in the hole, and that's the thing to remember, because sometimes you can be so deep in the hole that it's like, the deeper you are in the hole, the harder it's going to be to come out of it. But the reality is, he's going to say in chapter 2, he gives the Wall Street Journal reported that 70% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And that's really sad because I grew up like that. My family lived like that. And I started my life like that. And I was making enough money that it was paycheck to paycheck, but I had a lot of nice things. And I mean, I was still taking on debt, but I didn't feel like I was hurting for money, but I was still, I know I get paid. So pretty much my bank account's getting pretty close to empty, and then I get paid, and then I'm good again. And I have more than enough to pay my bills, but then I spend it all and then I get paid again. And the reality is, it doesn't matter if you're making, especially if you're just starting out, you're not huge in debt. No matter what your salary is, there is a way with a little bit of sacrifice and some discipline in a relatively short amount of time to be at a place where you're not living paycheck to paycheck. You do not have to be part of that 70%. Even you could say, hey, I only make $30,000 a year, but if I made $40,000, I wouldn't be living paycheck to paycheck. You will, if you don't implement the right kinds of strategies. But you could be making $30,000 a year, and in 6 months have so much money saved up that you're not living paycheck to paycheck, that you've got enough to cover 2 months worth of your expenses. And that offers so much freedom. It is unbelievable. Yeah.
And it's interesting with money. I like how Dave puts it, and this may not be politically correct, but I'm a bigger guy, so I'm going to go with it. He talks about the idea that when you are physically fat or out of shape, it's easy to tell, right? But when you're financially out of shape, it's not. And that's scary. I never thought about that till I read this book a long time ago. He says, when you're physically fat, it is hard to be in denial because there's the ever-winding belt line. When you're financially fat, however, you can fake it and look good for a while. Your friends and family will participate in your fantasy/denial, what makes you believe you're doing just fine. And I'm like, that's so true. I mean, we know that in the reselling community. How many people do we know that have been posers, that have been out there and saying, hey, look at all the money I'm making, da-da-da. And then you find out they live their life because of credit cards, that they actually aren't making money in their business, right? That everything that they're flexing on the gram isn't real, right? I mean, I'm not even saying the reselling community. This is a major Instagram issue and a TikTok issue and every social media platform issue where people are trying to project something that is not real. But the hard thing, the interesting thing about it is that they can fool themselves into believing that it's okay, because when you use a credit card, like, you don't feel it, right? And we'll talk about this is why everything's very cash based, because you can easily, drop 1K and you don't feel it, right? But if you got to take out those bills and you got to count, right, 10 100s, or are there, anyways, 1,001 ones or whatever? I mean, whatever it is, 500 twos, like, you feel it. And that's the hard part. I mean, I know people that are house rich, but financially broke. Yeah. They have a really nice house. They have a nice car. Their kids are in private school, but they have no money and they're in constant debt, and it keeps growing. And it's like Stepford Wives, like perfect society and community, but everything's broken.
Yeah. And it's so sad because it really isn't that difficult to learn a lot of these concepts. In fact, so many of them, it's like one-liners. And again, it's that 80% of it's just, are you able to implement it? But the reality is most people don't even have the knowledge because our education system doesn't really teach financial literacy. Most people don't, they learn it at home, but what they learn is wrong and incorrect. And because society as a whole is falling for this, you don't even know you're doing something wrong. And that kind of is why chapter 2 is about denial, and that concept of, if you're fat, you can't deny it. Maybe you can deny it, but it's obvious. You can look in a mirror and see it, but you have to, on your own, be willing to look in the mirror and look at your bank account and say, there's something wrong. And he has this great line. I love it. It says, for your own good, for the good of your family and your future, grow a backbone. When something is wrong, stand up and say it is wrong, and don't back down. And that takes courage. It takes courage to say, you know what? I'm making financial mistakes. And maybe it's not, there are levels you could say, hey, but I'm not like John down the street, man. He gambles, he gets his paycheck and he goes out and he gambles it, and he's about to lose his family. And at least I'm paying my bills with my money. That's true. But just little things that you can do, and you could say, you know what? I'm not where I could be. And it takes courage. But then once you recognize it, you have to do something about it. And that's why I love the idea of stand up, grow a backbone, and be willing to say something's wrong and it has to be fixed. And it's like that with, think of like an AA program, right? Like one of the first steps is always just admitting. And if you can get to that place where you can admit there is something broken and it needs to be fixed. If you don't get to that place, if you think everything is okay, you're not going to change anything. You're just not, because you have no reason to change. The moment you say, hey, reality, it's broken, then you're taking the first step to making some difference, making some changes that will change your life forever.
And to be real, pain is part of the process of change, right? He talks about that in chapter 2, that change is painful. Few people have the courage to seek out change. Most people won't change until the pain of where they are exceeds the pain of change, right? But he talks about this couple who, they were faking everything financially. And then eventually, I believe the wife gets laid off, Sarah. And then luckily they were still able to manage things. But it was like a wake up call, right? And he keeps using the weight analogy, and the fact that, do you really want to wait until a heart attack, right? Before you start making changes? I'm going to be real. Like I don't talk about this too much, but I've been trying to work on my own health. And you know what was the super wake up call? Was the pandemic. Right? Because you start seeing the individuals that are getting hit hard with the pandemic, it's dudes like me, right? There's a certain age range, but once it goes below that age range, it's people with pre-existing conditions. And one of them being that, they have diabetes and so on. I don't have any of that, but I don't want that, right? So that was enough for me to go, hey, it's time for me to start eating right. It's time for me to start working out. It's going to be a long journey, because I got to tell you, I do love that food, but it's a painful change that I need to make it, because the pain that I'll endure from, like, I don't know, not getting to eat what I want, or having to work out, or like the other day, just I was dying from whatever I did from working out, to way better than me ending up in a hospital because I didn't take care of myself. And it's the same thing with finances, right? Maybe during this pandemic, it was a wake up call for some of you and going, hold up. we got to figure something out. Like, luckily, we were in a profession as resellers where we were able to rebound quickly and take care of things. Or maybe you were in a profession that was deemed essential and you were okay. So if that happened, but you recognize that your finances were in a bad place, maybe that was enough of a wake-up call. And if you're hearing this now, maybe this is the wake-up call saying, hey, it's time for me to pick up Total Money Makeover, get my finances in order, and make sure that I'm okay if things get really bad.
Yeah, and it's kind of cool because one of our listeners was actually got to do the debt-free scream on the Dave Ramsey show.
Episode and on Instagram.
And it's so cool that she was able to do that, and she even mentioned
Mary McLean.
Us on the show, and it was such an honor to hear that. But there are real people that you know in your community who this is working for, and it's changing their life. And chapter 3 goes into a lot of the myths that people believe in, and kind of there's a lot of key points I want to talk about.
So many in here?
Yeah, and we definitely can't talk about all of them, but one of the key ideas, and I think that people need to take away, and one of the central myths is that you need to have credit. You need to build a credit score. Debt is a good thing as long as you use it correctly. And I've listened to a show, and over, people will call in and say things like, but you need good credit to buy this. You need good credit. And his response always is, no, you don't. You need cash. If you have cash, you can buy it. And they're like, yeah, but if you need to get a car, you save and you buy a car in cash. Well, but you can't get a home loan without credit. Yeah, you can. You don't need a FICO score to get a home loan. There's certain things you can have, and if you got enough down, you buy a house, right? So the reality is you don't need, and our society tells you that is a good thing. And think about it. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. In fact, most companies, like for instance, he gives examples of like Sears and JCPenney's, they don't make the majority of their money from the sales that they make. The majority of their money is coming from the bank end of it. The fact 100%. That people have credit and then they're buying and they're paying interest. That's where they're really making their money. Well, he says this. He says,
let me interject real quick before you say it. Think about it. Every time you walk into a Target or you walk in anywhere, what's the first question they ask you?
Yeah, do you want our card? Do you have our card?
Yeah, right.
Discount with our card.
Hey, you can get 5% off if you sign up everywhere you go. Just you may not notice it because it happens so much. But just go one time and wait. Walmart, I think, is the only place that doesn't do that.
Yeah, and if you're a salesperson, like if you understand sales, they wouldn't be pushing it if that's not where they're making their money at, right? They push those things because that is where the money comes from. Every time they get one, it is that's the sale. That's where they make money on the items they're selling. But a car dealership, yeah, the reason they can come down on prices is if you finance with them, that's where the money is. That's what they really want is the finance. And so he makes this thing. He says, however, our culture teaches us to live for the now. I want it. We scream, and we can get it if we are willing to go into debt. Debt is a means to obtain the I want it's before we can afford them. And there's this great Saturday Night Live skit. It is one of my favorite Saturday Night Live skits, and it's an older one, but it's like a guy teaching a husband and wife finances. And he's like, I've got this amazing book and it's free. You don't even have to pay for it. And it'll teach you how to be financially wise and get out of debt and all this stuff. And it's one page and it has one line, and it's, if you can't afford it, don't buy it. And they're like, what? Really? And he's like, yep, it's that simple. And they're like, but what if we don't have any money and we want this thing? Then don't buy it. But what if, and they're just buying into what the culture says, and they satirize it and they make it obnoxious. But the truth is, that's what so many of us believe. Hey, I've got an extra $100 in my account, but hey, if I get this TV that's $600, it's only $23 a month, right? That's nothing. I got an extra $100 every month in my bank. I could pay $23 a month. But if instead of paying $23 a month, you'd have waited 4 months and just saved that $100 each time, you could have bought it outright and you wouldn't have paid all of the interest, and you would have had more cash available for other things. And so you don't need to go into debt if you're willing to make some sacrifices. Debt is, and again, there are certain things like if you have debt, this isn't like shame on you, because we've all either been there or experienced it.
I was definitely there.
Yeah. And I'll give you an example. So a car is a good example in this. He talks about not buying a new car, always buying used, being willing, because so much of the value, as soon as you drive it off the lot, you just loses tons of value. And so many people know this, and they say things like, but I want a reliable car. Even my wife and I we went this a long time. It's like, but I just want to make sure I know my car is going to be good. And if I get a 4-year-old car, like maybe something will break on it. Well, the reality is if you buy a brand new car, in a few years, things are going to break on it and you're still going to have to pay those things. And let's say you buy a car and you buy a new car and it's like $17,000 more than the used car, right? And you could have driven a used car that cost $3,500 for the same 10, 20 years, and maybe you had to repair it twice. You had to like full on engine repair, and it was like $5,000. You're still going to be able to drive it for a longer amount of time for less money buying it used. And that's just a good example. And my wife and I remember the first time we bought a car in cash. We had rolled over a car, and we had saved up enough, and we sold a car that we had owned outright, and we had paid it off, for a couple of years. So we were able to get a little bit of money, and we walked into a used car lot, and we bought a 1999 4Runner, and we got a pretty good deal on it, and it was in really great condition. And I think we paid like $6,000, $6,500, something like that. And we paid in cash. And let me just say, that was the easiest car buying experience ever. We walked in, it was probably 20 minutes and we were out of there. And it was the easiest thing. Like there was not like filling out paperwork and sitting in. We walked in, we gave him the cash. We were able to talk him down more because we had cash, and we drove off the lot with it. And that was one of the greatest experiences of our life, to be able to drive away. And then we put like $1,500 in it over the next like couple of months, fixing a few things, and needed new struts, and needed this, needed that. And we're like, all right, we put $1,500 into this car, and we've gone already, I don't know, like 6-7 years with it, and only had to do a few minor things to it. And so if we would have bought a new car, we'd have probably already had to replace a few of those things anyway. So, and that's just one example of how saving up for a little bit and buying it instead of going into debt, it is such a life-changing thing.
Agree. I mean, and there's so many in here. I'm trying to look and go, okay, which one, where do we start? Right. I mean, there's a discussion of family, right? Should you loan out money to family members? But it doesn't really relate to this. But I will say that as a reseller, right, you always got to be careful, right, with your finances, in the sense that like it's very easy to find a deal and then you want to take out that loan, right? And so some of the easiest people to go to get that loan is family, right? But the hard part about that, and Dave Ramsey, I don't know if he talks about it in this chapter, I've heard him say it before, is like Thanksgiving tastes a little different.
Yeah. Well, and he says again too, like dinner with your family tastes different than dinner with your master. Again, going to that idea of like master and slave. Whoever, if you owe somebody money, you kind of,
and then if you can't pay it back, it's actually worse, right? And then it's awkward and it's weird. And I can tell you, part of being financially free for me was not breaking any bonds with my family, because I can tell you, my family has been there. We've had drama because somebody wanted a loan from somebody else, or somebody had loaned somebody money and they expected it to be paid back, and they were never paid back. So the idea is, when you're giving to someone, you're giving to them. You're not loaning to them, right? And if you can't do that, then you're not in you're in the right place to do that, right? I don't know. I feel strongly about that because I've seen it not only in my own situation, but I know plenty of other people where it's broken up family. But that's not exactly what we're talking about the podcast. But I thought it was a good point.
No, it's a good point. And I think family is even a good one. Family and friends, in the sense of not even just the loaning or borrowing money, but the idea of you are going to, if you implement these things, if you're willing to say, you know what, I want to get a new couch. And instead of financing the couch, I don't have enough money for the couch. It's going to take me 6 months of savings. I can save $100 each month because I have extra money to be able to buy this couch outright. So I'm going to have to go with my old couch for 6 months. When everybody else in culture and everybody else around you would just buy the couch and pay it off over the next 9 months, paying interest, paying extra. And it's like, but you get it now. And the whole idea, if you really think about it, we've been brainwashed to think you can have it now and pay for it later. And some of you even listening right now be like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like you can do that. But the reality is, just think, that is what you've been taught. And what he's saying, if it's true, which I've experienced, if you can get to the place where you can buy in cash, if you were to say, I'm just going to go 6 months with my old couch and I'm going to buy the new couch in 6 months when I have the money for it and I pay for it outright, people will say like, you could have just had it 6 months earlier. But there's something so much better in paying cash, not paying the interest. And it changes everything. But because culture, he says, you are going to experience ridicule. When your friends say, and some of you, again, because we haven't got to all the like step 1, step 2, but you're supposed to have $1,000 in savings for emergencies, right? So if something really bad happens, some of you say, but what if tires blow out and I need new tires and I can't afford it? I have to finance it. Okay. Well, if you've saved up that $1,000, you don't have to do that, right? You do that. And instead of paying interest on that fine, you pay yourself back that $1,000 until you get that $1,000 nest egg again. So you are your own bank that you can take from in a case of an emergency. But he says that you're going to experience ridicule. People are going to ridicule. They're going to say like, this is silly. And you will experience, some of you might even already be pushing against this, which just shows that this is a natural gut instinct from people. And he gives an example of a monkey experiment that happened. And he says that they put some really good bananas on top of this pole in this facility that had monkeys in it. And every time monkeys started to climb up to get to them, they would use like a fire hose and like spray them off, or they would knock them off, and to kind of teach them like, you're not allowed to climb this pole. And then what they did is they replaced one of the monkeys that knew about this with a new monkey. So the new monkey tries to climb the pole, and they didn't have to use the discipline to get them off. The other monkeys pulled them off. No, you're not allowed to climb up that, right? And eventually they slowly did that. They removed every monkey that had experienced the getting sprayed with the water, getting knocked off the pole, with monkeys that have never experienced it. But the culture of that monkey group had built into them, you can't do this. They don't know why. There's no like, we don't know why you're not allowed to climb there. I haven't ever experienced anything bad, but I know because everybody else says if I climb this pole, it's bad. And none of them would climb it, even though they had not experienced the problem. And so the reality is people are going to ridicule you. There's nothing wrong with doing that. And the reality is it's just because they don't know the better way. And if you can save it, it's the better way.
So, and the key thing, the key takeaway from this chapter and wrapping up this chapter is the idea that debt is not a tool. Right. And again, you've heard me on the podcast talk about using credit cards. I'll be transparent. Like, I'm not the greatest example, but it's not because I'm going into debt. I want to be clear about that. Like, I do not have credit card debt. I use my credit card as a tool.
Well, and here's the thing,
but the difference is
business is different. Business,
agreed. I mean, but there's a part of me that goes like, maybe I should go cash heavy. But I explained in that Reselling a Crisis episode why I don't do that.
Yeah, and again, it's hard because you have to. This book is aimed towards an individual, right? An individual's personal finance.
True. And
businesses operate differently. And I'm not saying it's good for business to have debt. If you can be debt-free business, that's great. But there are times when it makes sense. A lot of businesses take on debts, and it's for different reasons. And so, again, like I talked about, like potentially buying a trailer that might cost me $5,000 and getting it on a business loan and then paying it back slowly and basically making that my storage unit payment instead of paying a storage unit, but I'm building equity every time I pay. So there are reasons why you would do that, but if it's personal, it's a different story, right? You don't need it.
I just wanted to be out there.
No, that's good. So yeah, he says at the very end of this chapter, you have to start teaching kids early because kid branding is now commonplace. And I think we could see that YouTube, I mean, they've had to pass laws about advertising to kids, but I mean, kids are taught at a young age.
But let's talk about it as parents. Yeah, let's talk about it though. Like as parents, kids are watching what you're doing, right? And financially, like this is like a legacy thing, right? Not only, a lot of us, I love the fact that I'm showing my sons that there's a different way to make money, right? That they don't have to be part of the 9-to-5 system, that they have options, that they don't have to necessarily go to college. I want them to go to college. I encourage them to go to college, but it's not the end all. Right. But I also want them to know that it's a lot of hard work if you don't, because, getting that first job is going to be tough depending on the field that you're in. But on top of that, it's so key because, yeah, dude, the branding, like, do you remember going to college? Like, I remember my very first day, this was back in the day before they changed the laws, but every single credit card is out at the tables at freshman orientation. And they want to sign you up. And hey, we're going to give you this for free if you sign up here. We're going to give you this for free.
Get a free backpack.
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy. Now they have to, I think in California, they have to be across the street. They can't be but they're there. Like, you notice them, right? And one of the first places I fell into credit card debt. So if you're young and you're listening to this, don't do it. I remember my Discover card, $3,000 within 1 month after getting it, debt. And that debt stayed with me until my 30s. Because all I did is I bought more and I bought more and I bought more. And yeah, be careful. And one more thing I want to run on. He gives a practical discussion about debt consolidation. Did you do any debt consolidation?
No, I actually learned really young about that. And that was one maybe positive thing I learned from my parents with finance. They were so afraid of bankruptcy. And again, he actually mentions that like bankruptcy is a life-changing thing. And a lot of people kind of believe like, hey, I'll just file bankruptcy if I need to. But my parents did the debt consolidation. And it destroyed them. It was worse on their credit. They had a bigger credit hit than if they would have done bankruptcy. And the amount they ended up paying, I mean, you get kind of sold like, hey, it's all one payment, it's a lower payment, but the reality is you end up paying more over time for that debt consolidation. And I'm not saying that that's not the right thing. Every situation is different. So we're not, Orlando and Mike.
I'm going to say it's not the right thing.
Okay.
Because I did it myself. I'll just say from my personal experience, it was not the right. Like if I could redo it, I wouldn't do it.
Yep.
So I actually did AmeriDebt, the thing he's actually talking about in the book. And I remember like I was naive. It's one of those things where I had so much debt. I'm like, who cares? Like let somebody else take care of it. Right. So AmeriDebt had some really good commercials back in the 2000s. It was the early 2000s. And I remember calling up and they're like, yeah, we'll take care of you. We'll negotiate a lower payment. We'll lump it all together. And then I remember I kept coming across Total Money Makeover. And I remember reading this section and I had like a year left. A year and a half. And then I started investigating and I'm like, I am paying so much to AmeriDebt. So much to AmeriDebt. And on top of that, my credit score wasn't getting any better. Yeah. It didn't improve anything.
These are not nonprofit organizations that are trying to help you. They're a business, which means they're making money, and they're not going to be making money on it unless you're paying that money.
So I actually called AmeriDebt and got out of AmeriDebt. I don't remember what it took. It's been so long. But it took a lot of phone calls. It took a lot of like, hey, I'm going to handle this. And then I personally called each credit card and renegotiated my payments. And I renegotiated my interest charges. And so I got it down and then I started doing the debt snowball and we'll talk about that. But yeah, I personally, if I could do it over, number one, I wouldn't use credit cards. Number two, debt consolidation. I was throwing away money with debt consolidation. Now, I will say, if it's the only way to be disciplined enough to pay debt, I don't know, maybe. But part of what we're talking about is having a budget. And if you can have a budget, you can handle it.
No, you can have a budget. And I'm going to be honest, maybe going to ruffle some feathers here. It would just be laziness. Honestly, it's a little bit of hard work. It's time sitting down, learning, and actually one of the principles he has is figuring out what your budget is and actually putting money in envelopes and using cash. Like if you have a clothing budget of $50 a month, you can't spend more than that. If you buy a shirt and you spend $37 on the shirt, well, you only have so much left now. And if you have any left over, hey, you can roll that into the next month and you have a little bit more. But when that envelope's gone, that money's gone. And there's no reason that you can't do that. If you say like, man, I don't, and going back to that first myth, if you think you don't have time to budget, but if you have time to do anything else, if you have time to watch some TV, if you have some time to just hang out and you've got time to take care of your finances. It's a bottom line. Like what you're saying is, I'm not prioritizing this. I don't think it's important enough to do. And laziness is going to cost you in the long term. It's going to cost you a ton. I mean, we did the fifth wheel. I mean, obviously my wife and I are living so frugally to pay off it's student loans is the big one because we just were foolish when we were young. We went to private schools and we got huge student loan debts. And so, yeah, we had to finance our fifth wheel, but we are making such large payments on it that we're not going to pay the entire time. But we look like, let's say you buy this thing for $70,000, $60,000, whatever it is, you buy a car for that. And you look at what you actually end up paying when you're done. 90,000, 100,000, 112,000, right? The number just goes up the amount of time. But you're like, but it's only this much a month. That's one of the worst things you can ask. How much is it a month? The better question is, how much am I going to actually end up paying on it? Because if you're buying something for $60,000 and you end up paying $100,000 for it, it didn't matter how much you were paying a month. You paid $40,000 more for that item. And so you have to be willing to look at that and say, it's not the right way to go. And
well, let me just share. The Federal Trade Commission actually in 2008 settled a lawsuit with AmeriDebt for $13 million. 287,000 consumers harmed by debt management scam. That's not our words. That's the Federal Trade Commission saying AmeriDebt was a scam. So be careful.
Yep.
All right.
That's good.
Let's move on.
All right. Do you have anything else, chapter 3? Or are you ready for chapter 4?
Let's go for it. But before we move on to 4, hey, if you haven't been following us on social media, we are Pure Soul Podcast on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. And we are Pure Soul Cast on Twitter. Always feel free to give us a call, 619-738-1170, 619-738-1170. Hey, if you want to share your story, that'd be great. Like if you can just cut it down in 1 or 2 minutes. I know we're not as cool as Dave Ramsey, but you have more chance of being played on the air on Pure as a Podcast than you're on Dave Ramsey. And on top of that, you can always shoot us an email, pureasapodcast@gmail.com. That's pureasapodcast@gmail.com. And last of all, I just wanted to say, before I do that, if you haven't been following us on YouTube, make sure to go over to YouTube, hit that subscribe and that bell notification. You can catch some of Mike's journeys in Colorado whenever they drop, or any other videos we choose to post. And as always, thank you so much for the reviews, and thank you for the continuing donations that have been really helpful. Appreciate everyone.
Yeah, it's good. All right, so moving on to chapter 4. And again, this is another chapter about myths. And so I feel bad because it won't be until our next level up review on this where we actually start to explain the steps and how to save and do the snowball and budgeting and all of the actual practical things. But if I could just say, before we even start this, if you're new to this and you don't know what to do, one of the very, very first things you can just start to do, cut as much expenses as you can. Maybe you don't need Netflix. Maybe you don't need to eat out as much as you're eating out. Maybe just cut a few expenses and start putting money away to get the $1,000. The faster you can get there, that alone is going to make a huge difference in your life. So that the next time something happens, you don't have to use your credit card to get new tires. You can just say, all right, cool, I'll pull it from this money. So do that. That's just a practical, take that away. And, in the following weeks, we'll do more. But this one's, again, talking about money myths. And this one is about the non-secrets of the rich, right? He's going to kind of demystify some of the things that the rich know. And one of the things he said is one of the underlying problems is the quest for easy wealth. Quick, easy money is one of the oldest lies or myths in the book of the human race. And just think, like, if you were to walk into a Barnes & Noble, who does that anymore? If you go to Amazon or anything and you pick up a book or a program, I would say probably 95% of them on money are going to be get rich quick schemes. And it's so sad to see. And even some of the ones we reviewed, like, we try and point out, like, hey, maybe we think this isn't good, but here's some good things you can glean from it. But the reality is there's no such thing. There's no such thing as easy money. And if you are in debt, or you're not in debt, but you want to get ahead and become wealthy and build wealth, it takes time. But again, going back to what I said, 10 years is going to pass no matter what. I just celebrated 10 years, or about to celebrate 9 years with my wife, but we've been together for 10 years. And just thinking that 10 years, it just goes so fast. And so the decisions you're making today, it's going to have ramifications 10 years from now. And if you think, you know what, if I did the math, you know what, Mike, Orlando, I spent some time and I looked at it and I figured out with the amount of money I make, if I don't make any more raises and I can't scale my business anymore, it's going to take me 10 years to get out of debt. And it just seems too hard and you just don't do it. 10 years is going to go by and you're going to look back and you're going to go, oh man, if I'd be done right now. So there is no get rich quick. And I love the fact that the book doesn't push that.
Agreed. And it's interesting because it is a bunch of like, here's the myth, here's the truth, here's the myth, here's the truth. And I will say, when you start this program, there's going to be resistance. It's going to feel weird. Like, give you an example. Like, one of them is that you always won't use cash, right? And your mind, whenever you try to do something different, will try to rationalize anything that is not the norm, right? At least that's my experience. And I remember this was one of those. I remember thinking, like, at that time I was married and I'm like, okay, if anybody knows that she has all that money in her purse, like, we're going to be in a bad place. Because we would always, like, the payday, like, what do you do with the paycheck when you do this plan? You go and you cash the check out, right? Because you're telling where your money goes. And so all your money goes into envelopes. So you can have a fat stack of envelopes to cash. Now, I'll give you the other side. If you're thinking about, like, well, yeah, it's kind of dangerous, Orlando. Listen, if you have a cell phone, you already have something that's worth a lot of money. We're all carrying $1,000. I mean, not all of us. I don't have $1,000 iPhone 11 Max Pro, whatever you call it, but mine is worth several $100s. I still have my iPhone 8 Plus. But we're in the society where, like, the cell phone has been the great equalizer of all. We all carry expensive stuff on us. So there are ways to manage this. And again, you're not flaunting it, you're not sharing it. But the reason I share that, I'm not trying to get into the details of it all, is that when you read some of these, you might buck against some of them. Because it may sound unconventional because you've been so used to doing things a certain way. Right. And it's because the arguments are done so well. I mean, we already talked about America, and I was clear, like, they were good. Yeah. They sold me on the phone. Right.
And going back to that cash idea, because you were saying, like, carrying cash and, like, okay, the danger of it. and again, it's risk to reward ratio. And it is really hard. Like I remember I had a hard time convincing my wife at the beginning to do cash. And so we started doing it a little bit different. I actually like created like fake bank accounts that like I would label how much money in our bank account was allotted to each thing. And that was really difficult to do. And then eventually we went to cash. But it's a paradigm shift. You have to think differently. And yeah, you might think, okay, I might get robbed. The reality is the risk of you actually being robbed is so low. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen or that it hasn't happened to you, but it's already so low. But the truth is, if you're using credit or you don't know where your money's going, if I were to say right now, how much did you spend last month on fast food? How much did you spend on entertainment? How much? And if you can't give me that number, if you can't say, well, I spent, $350 on groceries and I spent this, if you don't know those numbers, you might be spending way more than you think you are. And that is human nature. We tend to underestimate the things that we should be overestimating and overestimating the things we should be underestimating. We just do that. We naturally go the wrong way. And you are being robbed every time you're using credit. Over the course of 5 years, the amount of extra you're spending on interest, you've just been robbed twice. Somebody's come and taken $1,000 out of your purse or out of your wallet because you spent that much more on interest to have things now that you can't afford. And so you're being robbed guaranteed if you're using credit. If you're paying with cash, is there a risk that you might be robbed and lose the $300 you brought in cash so that you can buy groceries? Maybe that could happen. And if it does happen, that would be terrible. But I promise you, if you're spending credit, you've been robbed more than $300 this year.
Yeah, it's true. It's an interesting way to put it, but I see what you're saying. Now, I wanted to address the trailer thing here.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's different. What he says is different.
No, I know what he says is different, but I think it's a great example because here he talks about, he says the myth, mobile homes or trailers will allow me to own something instead of renting. And that will help me to become wealthy. Truth, trailers go down in value rapidly, making your chance for wealth building less than if you had rented. But your scenario is the positive scenario that he mentions later on, right? And what were some of the reasons you went to a trailer?
Well, so basically what he's saying is when it comes to real estate, if you buy a mobile home, you're actually it's not going to appreciate the same way that real property on a permanent foundation appreciates. And that's something you learn if you're buying houses, but there's an allure to it because it's cheaper. Like I can get this mobile home for $100,000 or I can get the same looking house for $175,000. It's just low numbers, I know, but especially for California. But if you buy that $100,000 mobile home, it's almost never going to go up in value. Or if it is, it's going to go up very, very small. Usually it goes down. Whereas that $175,000 house in the same 10-year period might go up 40%. So it's not a good idea to think of that usually to buy, even though it's cheaper in the short term. But what I'm doing and what I did is I said, hey, my rent is $1,600 a month. And I have rented at this house for 5 years. And I did the math of how much I paid my landlord. And I actually, because it's public record, I saw how much he spent for his house. And so I did the math and I think I paid off like 60% of his mortgage. If he was just pouring it all into principal, I paid off 60% of his house in the 5 years that I was there. I have nothing to show for it. Absolutely nothing. And so we decided we're going to buy a fifth wheel and we're going to finance it. And again, it would have been better if we could have bought it with cash, but we were in a situation where it's like, we've got to do this. My wife's going to be staying home. My son has health problems. He can't go to daycare. She has to leave her job. She's going to do the reselling and we, things just look different. We have to do this. But if we can make that same $1,600 a month payment for our trailer, we own it in 2 years. And then we sell it for, maybe we bought it for $60,000 and we sell it for $30,000. So yeah, we lost $30,000. But when I walk away, imagine if I walked away from renting for 5 years and as I left, he's like, oh yeah, here, by the way, here's $30,000. Thanks for renting for my house for 5 years,
sure.
Right? I'd be like, what? That's amazing. Thank you so much. That's what's going to happen when we sell our trailer, right? Like we are going to leave. We paid the same amount we would have paid in renting and we're going to walk away with cash. So is it the right thing for everybody? No, especially if you have to go to like a mobile home park and you're paying a rent space and you're paying $700. You might end up actually worse off. I'm lucky enough to be able to put it on my in-laws property and not have to pay space rent, right? If I had to pay space rent, I don't know if it'd be worth it. So every situation is different. But yeah, so if you're in a place of, do I buy a house? Do I buy a mobile home? Do I rent? If you can buy a house, it's a much better option than buying a mobile home.
But the reason you did it though was not and for all the wrong reasons.
Right.
You know, it wasn't that you were hoping to make money and appreciate over time. It was you're downsizing. You're looking for an opportunity that your wife and I, what did I even say? You and your wife could live like no one else.
Right.
Right. And you have financial freedom right now.
Yep.
Right. You don't have to make millions or $500,000 or whatever. Mike might have an empire I don't know about, but
building it,
but he doesn't. Right. And I'm the same way. Like, I'm in San Diego. Is there the possibility that I may purchase something in the future? I don't know. You know, I go back and forth, right? I talked about owning a home and not owning a home. And I know Dave is different in his beliefs than Robert Kiyosaki about that. But ultimately is this idea of, hey, if you need, right, to be frugal, if you need to cut expenses, you do whatever you can right now, because that delayed gratification, right, that building up of wealth can take place. And later on, like you said, with going to the store and buying whatever you want or so on, you can do that, right? And do you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, like, when we first started getting debt free, and again, we're not perfectly debt free because we have student loans. We don't have consumer debt, which is, you know, nice. But when we were trying to become debt free, we made sacrifices. We went from eating out probably once a week, going on date nights, to we have $50 allotted every month that we can go out to dinner and to a movie or whatever. And that's like one time. It's not like we can go every single week now. So that means, all right, well, it's our date night. Let's go for a walk in the park, and maybe
you have to be picky about that.
Yeah.
At $50 in San Diego,
it doesn't go very far. Yeah. So maybe we do it once, and then we say, okay, well, it's date night, so let's go walk the park, and let's rent a Red Box for $1. And let's stay home and eat some popcorn. And instead of going, you know, for a $50 meal, we're doing a $2 date night. And we did that for months and months and months. And we got to a place where now our budget for date nights is 10 times that, right? Like, I'm not necessarily 10 times, but it's
nice.
It's not that much, but it's significantly higher, and we don't stress about it, right? So it's like, we want to go to a nice steak dinner. And the only reason we can do those things now and not go into debt is because we sacrificed hard for a while. And
now you're reselling, which added to it.
Yep.
Right. Gave you even more
freedom. So takeaway from this is get the $1,000, save that as fast as you can. There are things you can cut. I promise you, there's nobody living so frugally. Maybe like there are a handful of minimalists out there who have like one fork, one bowl, one of everything. And there's nowhere they can cut. They don't have any discretionary money that they're spending on stuff. But there's something, right? Like, I buy books a lot now. I try and have a little bit of a library, even though I don't have space. I keep a lot of them in my classroom and things. But there was a time when a new book came out and I really, really wanted it. Instead of spending the $15 for the new book, I went to the library. And sometimes they didn't have it and it was a new book, so I had to wait 3 months to rent it. But I loaned out another one. And so there are places you can cut. You can even get movies for free at the library. You can check out movies at the library. So there are things you can cut. And even if you can only cut $50 each month, $60 each month, save that until you have 1,000. And I promise you, your life will change.
Yeah. And so Dave wraps up that chapter by talking about being normal is being broke, right? And it's true. The stats back that up. The latest stats pre-pandemic was that 58% of Americans had less than $1,000 in savings. And maybe some of you that are listening are in that place. That's rough, right? So let's be abnormal. Let's be weird. Let's be strange, right? Because in the end, right, you're trying to create change that will affect you the rest of your life in a very positive way. And it's going to take discipline. It's going to take fortitude. It's going to take some pain. It's going to take some choices, but it is doable. And again, Mike and I aren't the shining examples of that, but we are examples of that, where I'm good. Like, I don't stress. I can't think of the last time I stressed about finances, for reals. Like, it's been a decade, right? At least a decade, maybe over. I can't remember when I got it.
But there was probably a year or two there where you had to budget hard.
Oh, and I'll share about that in the next level of review. I mean, there were some weird times where it was rough, but I gotta tell you, I don't regret. I'll give you one thing, and before we leave, every time I turn on air conditioning in my car is a reminder of how free I am financially. Every single. So you'll never see me rolling with the windows down, ever.
Yep. Quote of the week from Jocko Willink. And I know you hate this word, but discipline equals freedom. It's a quote. He gives it all the time. It's his motto. And it's true. Discipline now equals freedom later in every aspect of life. Financial discipline equals financial freedom. Business discipline equals business freedom. All of those things. If you're disciplined in little things now, you will be free that you do not have to be as disciplined later. And that's just the way it is.
100%. And I think we should end on that note. So tune in to the Next Level Up and pick up the book. It's in the link below. Listen, we'll get our 10 cents. You don't even have to get it. Get it from the library. You can actually find this for free, but I can't share that. But anyways, there's ways.
Just Google, right?
Just Google. Anyways, with that being said, hey, make sure to be real,
be relevant,
and be reselling. Late.